Take one.
How do you reimagine justice?
As I think about all the years that I sat in a courtroom, all the people that I sentenced, all of the parental rights that I terminated. Surely I did some of those wrong. And then I think about my personal life. The 18 years that my son served in prison. The 11 prisons that I visited to visit him. And the ugliness of all of that. I don't know that I can imagine. I don't know that I've dealt with the trauma myself of all that I saw. If these group of people can help me to reckon with all that I have seen and been a part of, then maybe I can imagine it.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Hello, from wherever you're joining us from around the world. My name is Jael Henry, and I am a director with the Raven Group, a public policy and strategic communications firm based out of Washington, D.C. It is my honor to be the moderator of today's book event on healing, human dignity, and reimagining justice, which is the third in a series of virtual book events on parsimony and other radical ideas about justice. Our conversation today will be powerful, personal, and reflective, as you could probably tell by the video we used to open up the event. We have three book contributors with us today, and I learn a lot whenever I hear them speak, so I know you will too. First, we have Dr. Emeka Jones Tapia. Dr. Tapia is the managing director for justice initiatives at Chicago Beyond. She's an experienced psychologist who is passionate about mental wellness, criminal justice reform, and supporting people who have experienced trauma. Since joining Chicago Beyond in 2018, Dr. Tapia collaborated to launch programs focused on positive family engagement for families who are justice involved, holistic healing supports within Chicago public schools, and peer-led healing supports for youth. She is currently leading the Holistic Action Alliance, a first of its kind multi-state coalition of correctional administrators, former correctional staff, and people formerly incarcerated that will develop strategies to reduce physical and emotional isolation for people working and confined within correctional systems. Dr. Tapia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm excited for today's conversation.
Next up, we have Catherine Huffman. Catherine serves as the director of the Square One Project. She is a founding principal at the Raven Group, a national advocacy, strategy, and communications firm based in Washington, D.C. for coworkers. For over 14 years, her work at Raven has focused primarily on criminal justice reform, civil and human rights advocacy, and evidence-based policymaking. Catherine's portfolio comprises multifaceted projects that draw on political strategy, legal analysis, strategic communications, and creative outreach to a variety of people, communities, and stakeholders. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Ja. Very nice to be here today. Hi, Neka.
And finally, we have Judge Nancy Gertner. Judge Gertner is a former U.S. federal judge who built her career around standing up for women's rights, civil liberties, and justice for all. Judge Gertner was appointed to the federal bench of the U.S. District Court of Massachusetts by President Bill Clinton in 1994. She retired from the bench in 2011 to teach at Harvard Law School. Named one of the most influential lawyers of the past 25 years by Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly, Judge Gertner has written and spoken throughout the U.S., Europe, and Asia. She has published widely on sentencing, discrimination, and forensic evidence, women's rights, and the jury system. Her autobiography, In Defense of Women, Memoirs of an Unrepentant Advocate, was published in 2011. Thank you for being here, Judge Gertner.
Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to speak with the three of you. And my first question is for you, Catherine. We just watched a deeply personal video from Durham, North Carolina Mayor Elaine O'Neill, who is a member of the Square One Project's Collaborative for Reckoning and Justice. Mayor O'Neill's story highlights the centrality of the concept we're focused on here today: healing, human dignity, and reimagining justice. Tell us about the way that Parsimony explores these ideas, and how did they emerge, and how are they continuing to show up in Square One's work?
Great. Thank you, Ja, for that question. Nancy and Eka, it's just such a joy to be able to talk with you all today about parsimony and about the concepts there. So very glad to be here. So the Parsimony and Other Radical Ideas About Justice came out of the work of Square One's executive session, which was a group of people who came together repeatedly over several years to meet and talk and really think about a question that we put on the table, which was, if we were going to start from a new square one and really think about how we want to deal with violence, with racism, with poverty, with the large-scale social problems that at this point our country primarily responds to with a punitive justice system approach, what would that look like? Would a new system that we created from a new square one look anything like the one that we currently have? And this incredible group of people, which included Aneka and Nancy, came together to talk about this, to think about this, to write about this, in order to share their ideas. This was not a consensus-based process, so we didn't come out with a list of, here are the 11 recommendations that are going to solve everything. Instead, what came out of that process, in part, was this book, Parsimony and Other Radical Ideas About Justice. And it reflects a lot of the themes that came out in that work. What we began to recognize was that however people might be approaching it and whatever they might be actually doing in their day jobs or in their personal lives, some of these concepts, the idea of the importance of healing, which we collectively saw as largely a failure of the justice system. Not only was it not providing healing, it was in fact actively harming people who worked in it, people who were residing in it, people who were touched by it through their families and through their communities in all of these ways. This concept of the importance of human dignity and of being able to recognize that human dignity in every person on a personal one-to-one level, but also in a systemic and in a structural way. The system itself, we realized, was undermining the human dignity of the people who were involved with it. Again, whoever they might be, that was not something that was specific to only people who were incarcerated or only people who were being moved through the court system because they had been arrested and charged. It also was a system that was dehumanizing the people who worked in it and the people who were in the communities and families that were touched by it. And then this idea of reimagining justice from the start, what we realized was that until we really start to reckon with the history of what our system has done, of the history of the ways in which it has been a tool of white supremacy, of deep structural racism, that we wouldn't really be able to truly reimagine, and not just reimagine, but actually act and move into a new future that centered these other values without really thinking about reckoning. And so the work that Square One was doing then and that we are doing now, thanks in large part to the incredible work and advice that came out of the executive session and out of this book, really focuses on that concept. How do we reckon? What does that mean in real life? This is a concept that as a nation, we have never done. We've never really thought about it. To the extent that it comes up, it becomes very quickly something that is either a polarizing discussion or it's something that just seems so difficult that it just gets pushed away. So our work now through our national collaborative, which Mayor O'Neill is a part of, and through other partnerships in states and with other partners, is really looking at how can we support people and learn about and model and share the concept of reckoning in all the ways that it plays out, whether that's personal, whether that's professional, whether that's political, all of these are things that we as individuals and as a nation and everything in between really need to be thinking about. So that's the work that we're about right now.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And Judge Gertner, I want to go to you next because the chapter you wrote on reimagining judging is also a personal reflection about your time on the bench. Speak to us about your chapter, what lessons you hope folks take out of it, and what did you learn about yourself when you were writing it?
I sat through the executive session, participated in the executive session, and every time someone said something that moved me, which was regularly, I said, judges never hear this conversation. Judges are inoculated from this conversation. And what we just heard from Mayor O'Neill reflects that. Judges are stuck in boxes and encouraged to stay in the boxes of judging and not ever to see the actual impact of what they have done in the world. And the conversation and other work that I've done sort of forced me to ask the question of why that was so, why judges are in boxes. The first time I spoke, literally, I think it was 2 years after I left the bench, I was supposed to give an extemporaneous talk. And I got up on the podium and I said, I've been a judge for 17 years. I sentenced hundreds of largely men to sentences, 80% of which I believe to be disproportionate, unjust, and unfair. And that was the beginning. And that was why I wanted to be a part of the executive session, because I wanted to hear more about that. So I then began to think about what is it about the role? What is it about American judging? What is it about the constraints that people feel in the job that meant that they never looked beyond the box, and how we could begin to change that. Judges are largely white all across the country, largely male, largely former prosecutors, come to the bench with a certain set of rules and premises and assumptions, and those are never challenged. And they're never challenged because the job is, let me make sure I don't do anything wrong. I don't violate the law, but not whether I'm doing anything right. And one of the things about the Square One project was when talking about reckoning, which in my universe I began to look at as a question of accountability. Judges will feel accountable to not being reversed, but that of course is an absurd concept, as if that's the only relevance. Am I staying within the lines? Not whether the lines are fair, not whether the outcome makes sense, and not whether we have affected justice. So the conversation around the table forced me to think about what I'd done, why I had done it, the ways in which the role keeps us in these categories, and enhanced work that I was doing of going out and interviewing some of the men that I had sentenced. Interviewing some of the men that I had sentenced to see the difference between what I heard in the courtroom, what I understood, and what their lives were like. And it is, as Mayor O'Neill describes, deeply, deeply painful to hear. Led me to think about then why this all happened, why judges are like this, and what the impact is. It's not just the impact of unfairness in the individual case. It's really the fact that you become immunized. Over time on the bench, you become immunized to the impact of what it is you're doing. I began to talk about it as the habits of mass incarceration. You begin to think that 30 years is an appropriate sentence for a drug crime, life for marijuana. You begin to be inoculated to the real harms that are in front of you, sometimes because you can't do anything about it, sometimes because the law really does prevent you, sometimes even if the law stands in the way, you should still remember what it is you've done. So it on the one hand, as I said, it forced me to think about things that I had not thought about on the bench, then ask the question of why judges don't think about that, why I didn't think about that, and how that we can begin to change that. James Foreman, who wrote a wonderful book, described the criminal justice system as a system that lacks accountability, that all of the players in it stay in their little role and fail to see the whole. And the executive session was forcing me to see the whole, to take account of the whole. And it was chilling. So I think this is a critical conversation that I want to remain a part of.
And I think your remarks make me think about reckoning as a concept and us not needing to just look at it as a concept. It is deeply personal. It can be painful at times, but it can be transformational as well. And I hope that all of those things come through in our conversation today. And like your chapter on holistic safety at the center of incarceration examines the trauma generated by correctional institutions, both for people who live there and people who work there, and looks at how we can make transformational changes to reduce the harm caused by those systems. What does transformational change mean in correctional institutions? Where does that take us over the long term?
I think for me, transformational change is about connection, and connection specifically with ourselves and the fullness of who we are and who we bring into this work, and connection with other people in a way that allows us to see the value in other people and to really humanize each other. And I remember when I joined the executive session, I had just retired from corrections. I think at that point I had retired for about 4 months. And I was very much so going through my own personal reckoning process. And for me, and it is in fact a process, for me, it started with an acknowledgement of the things that I had done, not the things that the system made me do. There were some of those, but the things that I personally had to take responsibility for. And that's what I heard in Judge O'Neill's commentary on the video. She's in that reckoning process, and it's painful, but it's necessary. That's what I read in Judge Gertner's chapter, this reckoning process of what we've done. And transformational change as it relates to my work in corrections was about me connecting with myself again and my values and who I was as a full person. It was acknowledging the good decisions that I made and also the bad decisions that I made. And it was me connecting with other people who represented groups of people I had harmed. And for me, transformation in corrections requires people who are currently in the system to do just that, to connect with themselves, to connect with other people. And connection over the long term means that policies and practices shift in a way that humanizes people and to make people's experiences more humanizing. And at its core, I believe that means a shift from a system of punishment because we're no longer far removed from it. And instead, it means a shift towards a system that can hold people accountable, but also uplift the healing process that is necessary. Now, what could this look like in a correctional institution? It would look like more humanizing language. It would look like increased opportunities to heal from harm that Catherine mentioned in the beginning. It would look like increased opportunities for engagement with our families, our communities. It would look like the creation of policies and practices with the very people who are directly impacted by those policies and practices. And it would look like training and encouraging staff to be more human with the people who are incarcerated in the system and so much more. And while this idea of transformation being about connection sounds very simple, it is a complete shift in how the American correctional system exists today. Because right now, our correctional system is all about disconnection, right? Like disconnection from community, disconnection from family, disconnection from resources, even disconnection from other people who are a part of the very system that you're in. And that disconnection with the humanity of another person is really what lays the ground, the foundation for dehumanization. And why should we care? And I'm gonna end with this. Because many people will think that, oh, what they are talking about only impacts the people who are in the system. And what I tried to articulate in my chapter is that each of us is impacted by this pervasive trauma that happens in this system. Most of the significant effects are, of course, felt by the people who are incarcerated in the system and the staff who are working in the system, but we interact with these individuals every day. Like more than half of the adults in the United States have had an immediate family member incarcerated. Hundreds of thousands of people work in this system. Millions of people have been incarcerated in this system. And there are families, there are community members. And so it's like when we understand that when people experience trauma without opportunities to heal, that it increases the risk of people harming other people and themselves, then we have to care.
Thank you for that. This next question is for all of you. Many of the chapters in parts 3 and 4 of the book pull on the lived experiences of the authors. What inspired you all to work for change in the way we approach justice in this country? And Judge Gertner, we'll start with you.
Well, I think as soon as I left the bench, I knew that I wanted to come to grips with what that 17 years of judging had been. I knew that there was a disconnect between what I felt obliged to do and what I thought was right. And I know that many other judges felt that as well. And I first wanted to say that out loud. Judges usually don't say that out loud. None of us say that out loud, right? You don't want to admit that the time that you spent was somehow doing wrong and not right. Wrong, not in that I violated the law, but wrong in that I was not really being accountable for results, that I wasn't really healing, that I wasn't thinking about impact. So I wanted to think about and talk about how the damage that we were all affecting and what to do about that. And for me, as I kid around, I've never met a microphone I didn't like. Speaking about it and writing about it and going on television and sort of breaking out of the role that I was in for 17 years was terribly important. And so that meant not just meeting the men that I had sentenced, but talking about what those meetings affected, writing about it, and sharing with people the real harm that judges have been doing over the years, and reaching out in all sorts of ways. The public has been traumatized as well. The public has been immunized, so that the discussion about the criminal legal system is invariably a bidding war about how much time people should be doing. If 5 years didn't work to end burglaries, let's go to 10, let's go to 20, let's go to 30. What's the limiting principle? How do we really come to grips with what we have done? So, I mean, for me, the engagement is a public engagement, because I think people have to know the real consequences of what it is that we have done. And writing this chapter was part of that public engagement. Being part of Square One was part of that engagement as well. It's almost as if we have all been immunized, so that we no longer blink when the marijuana dealer gets life. We no longer blink when people wind up getting imprisoned for decades on decades. I might add that traveling outside of the US also helps, because no one except perhaps in Russia and China understand how we have gotten to this point. So I think public engagement is what my contribution will be, and I will continue.
Catherine, you want to go next?
Yeah, it's such a great question, sort of thinking about the ways that all of these different things connect and what brings all of us together around these important questions. For me, there are a lot of ways to answer that question, but in thinking about why engage in this particular type of process, I'm a lawyer. I worked for some years litigating cases having to do with conditions of confinement and access to medical and mental health care in prisons and jails in this country. Moved from that into policy making, policy advocacy around those issues, feeling like, with litigation, there's already been a problem. Let's try to move upstream and think about policy making, and spent many years doing that and still do that work. And it's incredibly important to think about how can we persuade and engage our policymakers and folks who develop programming in making change within the system and far beyond the justice system itself. But what really brings me to these questions is the sense that unless and until we really do find a way to collectively and personally reckon with this harm that has been happening for so very long, we are always going to be, at best, having just pushed the boulder up the hill, and it's going to roll back down as soon as we stop holding it every time. Because without a sense and an understanding of where we've been and what really needs to change foundationally, how we really can begin to center healing, our own and that of others who have been harmed over years, decades, centuries by the ways in which this has all worked, we're always going to be just right underneath that boulder at best. So that's where I really feel like the ways in which we can think about what does this actually take? What would something new actually look like? How do we have to understand our past in order to really make change for the future that is sustainable and not just something that was put together to last for a moment, but that can fall apart at any time? That's what we have to be. That's what we have to be doing.
Dr. Tapia, please feel free to chime in.
It's interesting how we're each bringing our personal stories together in this, and collectively that is what we recognize will result in systems change. So it takes like this vulnerability. So I just wanted to highlight that, and hopefully other people will engage with that level of vulnerability across time to really shift the system. I think for me, so here I was, this psychologist who knew all of the signs of trauma and knew how to mitigate the effects of it, yet I was traumatized working in the system. Here I was, a person who had experienced the incarceration of many people who I loved, and I knew what it did to people and to families and communities, yet I caused hurt to people and families and communities by my role in the system. And so I recognized that the system was bigger than me. Like it was bigger than who I was as an individual and my personal story. And like Catherine said, that boulder, I no longer wanted to be behind it. And I realized that to achieve justice, I had to become a part of a larger we that would be bigger than the system, bigger than the boulder, bigger have more endurance than the system, and that we had to approach this fight for justice from every angle, from people fighting for justice from the inside, from people fighting for change from the outside. And for me, that culminated in this idea of holistic safety, like bringing all of these groups of people together who have been impacted by the system to say that we deserve better and we are going to actively build towards that. And I wanted to be a part of that. And being a part of the executive session with these, all of us coming from different backgrounds, and just like the four of us bringing our personal stories and our personal selves into this, realizing that that room changed the narrative for so many of us. And that room, by changing the narrative, shifted systems. It was this reverberating impact from that room that shifted so many parts of the system. And I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to use that model to shift the correctional system.
I think something that's really important, just listen to all three of you speak, is that we all come to the work from different places. I come from the work of a kid who grew up in Dominica with 70,000 people and moving to America and realizing that the place I was promised wasn't directly exactly what I thought it would be. And then having to come to terms with that, looking at how it impacted me and the people who I grew up with in the community I did in Harlem, how that impacted me when I went to college and seeing the disparities in the way that my classmates in very rich Suffolk, Long Island experienced college to how I experienced college. And I think those things come across really strongly in your chapters. It comes across really strongly by just like listening to you all speak. But Aneka, something that you talked about with like vulnerability and like how that transfers over to narrative change is really important. And this question is for all of you. And a lot of times when we have conversations around justice, we're centered in retribution. How do we shift that narrative? How do we get folks to put healing and human dignity at the forefront of how we think about justice? And Catherine, why don't you start us off?
Ja, thank you for sharing all of that. I think that making it possible to shift the conversation about justice away from one of retribution to one of healing and human dignity goes back to what Aneka was talking about earlier. It's really about connection, and it's really about proximity to the traumas, to the experiences, to the lives that all of us share, especially people who are living in communities that have been most impacted by the heavy footprint of the justice system. But as we've been hearing from everyone today, this is something that affects every person in this country, everyone in the world in different ways, but everyone in this country, whether we're aware of it or not. And so really starting to create ways in which we can have connection with each other, in which we can hear from, and not just hear from, but be led by and be following people who have direct experience in all the different ways of the justice system is really key, because that allows us to center that human dignity from the start in a way that makes it much more difficult to dismiss people and want to punish them, and makes us much more interested in what would it actually take for this person to be able to heal. Zooming that out to the larger picture of broader cultural narrative is a really, really difficult thing, but this type of work is what makes it possible. As a nation, we just don't have the muscles for these types of conversations that have to do with wanting to really connect and understand each other and find ways to create healing, as opposed to wanting to be separate to protect our own power, to protect our own selves and our own most immediate circles. That's true across the board. And our hope is that this type of work will make it possible for people to see examples of that type of connection, and then actually to be able to replicate it, to create their own versions of it, to really start to understand it themselves. That's what's going to make this real deep narrative change possible. Right now, we don't even have anything to look at as examples in most places, but the more that we can find the examples that already are happening, the ways in which many people at the local community level are looking for ways to reckon, are looking for ways to connect, are looking for ways to create healing and safety within their own communities, is the starting point. And then being able to learn from that and to think about how we can apply it in our own lives and communities and share that out more broadly will make it possible for us to begin to, us collectively as a nation, to begin to make different assumptions about what justice means and about how we can approach it and what its goals should be.
Nneka, how do we shift that narrative?
I think in addition to the connection, or maybe in relationship to the connection piece, it's also about telling the full narrative. Like if the story begins at the harm that someone caused, it's human to want retribution. If the story begins with the harm that the person who caused harm endured over and over again, and perhaps the countless systems that failed that person, and this is what I saw in everyone I came into contact with in my tenure in corrections, then it is human to want healing. Like if the story ends with a person sitting in a jail or a prison cell, and we don't have to face the consequences of retribution, it's human to want retribution. But if the story ends with the person returning to my community or my neighborhood or my family, I'm human to want healing. And so telling the full narrative so that more people can understand the impact of the system we're dealing with today and the proximity that we each have to creating a system that actually works for us is, I believe, the path forward.
Judge Gertner, you have the last word of today's book conversation.
I see it in two respects. One is retribution doesn't work. And 40 years of mass incarceration has made that clear. It doesn't work to heal. It doesn't work to affect public safety. It doesn't work to reconstruct communities. It simply doesn't work. And that point has to be made over and over again. Retribution is endless. It is never fulfilling to the victims or the public. There's no reason why we pick numbers, particular numbers, out of the air, disconnected from anything in life. And so it becomes sort of venting our spleen in the way we treat people. And then we put them in prisons. And as Nneka said, that we distance ourselves from them. We don't have to pay attention to them again. So the notion of writing about how they got there, the communities that they represent, the impact of their absence for the children and the partners and the communities is really critical. I think the most extraordinary observation I felt during one of our executive sessions was the ways in which violence in particular is considerably more complicated than anything I saw or anything I was empowered to do. That every single man that I sentenced who had committed a violent act had been a victim or a witness and was then a perpetrator, and sometimes all three. And the distinctions had long ago dissolved. And once you realize that, then you realize that meting out punishment for that any particular role just made no sense. So telling the stories of the system, one of the things I find in my work is that there was no functioning school in the neighborhoods where some of the men I sentenced came from. None. No water fountains, no guidance counselors, nothing. And so to tell those broader stories so that the narrative is not just what's the number that matches the person, because that number has no meaning in the abstract. It means something to him, but it has no meaning in the abstract. So I think we have to make the point both about the uselessness of retribution on the one hand and the narratives about human beings on the other. And that has made a difference in my life.
Thank you for that. And thank you all. Um, I'll speak for myself and say that my soul is smiling because of this conversation. I hope that everyone else watching at home felt what I'm feeling, but also got to hear a lot more about the chapters of the books that you all have worked on. I've got to see just how we can practice the things that we're preaching in the chapters as well. And we will put up a slide at the end of our conversation for everyone at home to scan and buy and purchase a copy of Parsimony and Other Radical Ideas About Justice. This is not the last of our virtual events. You will see our faces again. But thank you all for joining us, and this concludes our conversation.